Have you ever wanted to relive your fondest memories? Have you ever wanted to experience your favorite movie, book, album, or video game for the first time again? I know I have. It's a feeling that I see a lot of people going through recently. You want to go through all of the emotions your favorite games brought you when you first discovered them, only to realize that, unfortunately, you can't go back. I thought going back was impossible. Until today. The Dead Space Remake was one of my most anticipated games of 2023. It's a faithful remake of one of my all-time favorite games, and the first new entry in a franchise that's lain dormant for a whole decade. Going into the game, I assumed it would largely be a graphics overhaul with some minor and major additions and alterations to get the game to better suit the expanded universe and the games released after the original. What I didn't expect is for the Dead Space remake to completely surpass the original and become an undeniable masterpiece. Hello everyone, I'm a Total Dork, and today we're going to review Dead Space 2023. When I heard the rumor that a Dead Space remake was in the works, I was excited as hell for it. And when it was officially announced, that excitement kicked into overdrive. Like I said, the original was one of my favorite games of all time, and the recent success Capcom has had with the new Resident Evil games set a very high bar for Motive Studio, the developers behind this remake. Despite that excitement, one of the prevailing thoughts for myself and many others was questioning whether Dead Space needed a remake at all. The original game has a timeless quality to it. The gameplay is still held up after 15 whole years, with some exceptions here and there. And while the graphics aren't as crisp as modern games, the art style gave the original games a timeless quality, not unlike the Bungie-made Halo games. At first, the game was pitched to the public as a very faithful remake, but as we learned more and more about the game, more and more things seemed to change. Some of these changes were extremely significant. Point-to-point jumps and zero-gravity sections were replaced with the thruster-based movement we saw in the sequels. The Ishimura would become one continuous level rather than being split into sections that you can only access with the tram. And perhaps most significantly, Isaac Clarke would no longer be a silent protagonist, which necessitated entire conversations be completely rewritten. And when the remake was released, we could see entire encounters were completely remade from the ground up. Considering how much I love the original game, you might assume that I hate all these changes solely because they're different from the original game. But that's where you'd be wrong. I love all of these changes, and we'll talk about them in detail later on. What I want to talk about now is what makes a remake faithful to the original. When you think of a faithful remake, you're probably thinking of something that's an exact one-for-one copy of the original game. And while I won't say that games like that aren't faithful remakes, I would argue that for a remake to be faithful, it's far more important that it gives off the same feeling as the original game. In my eyes, it's perfectly acceptable to change elements of your game's story, tone, gameplay, etc., so long as it feels the same as the original game. You can get away with some targeted improvements as long as you stay true to the original ethos of the idea. And this is what the Dead Space remake does so well. It doesn't just copy the original game, slap a new coat of paint on it, charge you $70 and call it a day. Rather, it takes the ethos of Dead Space and its sequels and distills it into a new experience that feels like the original. A proper review of the entirety of Dead Space would be a multi-hour long affair, and I don't got time for that. So we're going to compare and contrast what the remake does better and worse than the original, starting with the good. The most noticeable change between the remake and the original is Isaac's talking. This is the change I was the most skeptical about going in. It took a little while for me to get used to it, but now that I've seen what it's like, I definitely prefer dialogue over no dialogue. In the original game, Isaac was always being told what to do by Hammond or Kendra, and it made him seem beneath them. But now with Isaac's new dialogue, he's part of a team instead of just following orders. Now Isaac is the one figuring out how to fix things on the Ishimura, which makes sense. That's what he was brought here to do. He's an engineer. The writers had to restructure a lot of the dialogue from the original game to add in Isaac's new lines, but it totally works. Speaking of restructuring dialogue, the writers used this as an opportunity to rework Hammond and Kendra's relationship. My biggest complaint about the original game was that from the second the game starts, Hammond and Kendra are at each other's throats for really no reason. For the remake, everyone is treating each other like they're part of a team. There's still tension between everyone and some distrust among the group, but they aren't shouting at each other like a failed marriage with only child Isaac looking on desperately trying to not rock the boat. I love the new interactions between Kendra and Hammond. The two of them and Isaac work much better as a team now, which makes the entire game a lot more enjoyable to sit through. But that's not the end of character improvements. All of the villains and side characters also got some massive improvements. The two pilots that you start the game with get names and personalities they didn't have in the original. They're not super detailed, fleshed out characters, but they feel like people for the brief time we're with them. And the other minor characters we meet and see throughout the rest of the game fit that same description, but I won't go into those characters to avoid spoilers. In the original game, the USG Ishimura was just a bunch of individual levels that were only connected by the trams, which act as loading screens between each level. But in the remake, the entire Ishimura is one giant playable space, similar to the Spencer Mansion in Resident Evil or the RPD headquarters in Resident Evil 2. This makes the entire ship feel more cohesive and provides a greater incentive for backtracking. Aside from a few situations, you can avoid taking the tram entirely in the remake. The entire map being one playable space also means there aren't any loading screens. One of the things people praised about the original game was how few instances the game took control away from the player. Removing loading screens and making the entire map one playable space adds to that feeling of control in a pretty significant way. Though if I had to complain, and this is a nitpick, I always enjoyed the feeling of relief in the original game when you made it back to the tram and had the moment to rest. You don't get that in this game. Chapters start and end at different points in the game, which isn't a bad thing, but it's something you don't get with the remake. What you do get in the remake is a greater emphasis on backtracking to find items around the map. The idea of backtracking for resources is a cornerstone in survival horror games, but Dead Space was always a pretty linear game with minimal backtracking, largely due to the Ishimura being split up into individual levels. But with the remake, you get the best of both worlds. You can backtrack for additional resources if you want to, or you can continue on with the mission and get resources naturally. If you choose to backtrack, you'll likely encounter the game's new intensity director, which is basically this game's equivalent of the director from the Left 4 Dead series. If you backtrack to get some resources, don't be surprised if the game throws a few necromorphs at you for your troubles. This new intensity director does exactly what the director does for Left 4 Dead. It keeps the player on their toes by randomizing encounters and making each playthrough slightly different from the last. It forces the player to make a choice. Do I backtrack for items and potentially get attacked, or do I keep moving forward with what I have? It adds an additional layer of depth to items and resource management, which I appreciate. You also have to assess on the fly whether the risk will be worth the reward. Plus, it'll make repeated playthroughs a lot more interesting. There's also a ton of other things the remake improves, like additional cutscenes and Easter eggs, new side quests that flesh out Nicole's role on the Ishimura, the new circuit breakers, a rework to the nodes and upgrade system, the updated 0G sections. I could go on, but I'll leave it there to avoid making this video several hours long, and we'll move on to the bad. I wouldn't be doing my job right if I didn't find something about the game to criticize. Fortunately, I had a really hard time finding things to complain about with this game, and it seems as though I'm not alone. Just about every review is lavishing praise on this game, and the only negative fan reviews I've seen boil down to questioning whether there needs to be a remake at all. So this section is largely going to be nitpicks. One genuine complaint I've seen is that the resolution and frame rate can be inconsistent at times. However, patches for this exact bug are going out as I'm recording. A patch should be out for all platforms by the time you're watching this. The only other really major complaint I've seen repeated is that there aren't Russian subtitles in the game currently. Obviously, this doesn't affect me and likely won't affect anyone watching this video, but it's something that should be addressed by Motive. relive. Hopefully you picked up on the fact that one of the biggest complaints around the game right now is that subtitles aren't available in one specific language, which should tell you just how great a job the developers did. For most other games, the biggest complaints are pointing out problems with the story, glitches in the gameplay, poor design choices, or general lack of content, so missing subtitles being a high priority complaint is actually really great news. The only other complaints I see about the game are really nitpicks. Sometimes items will jitter in place, but this happens in a lot of other games, to be honest, and it's a very uncommon bug here. In my entire first playthrough, I saw this happen maybe once or twice. Some people aren't happy with the character redesigns. I personally don't mind them, but Nicole looks a bit too much like Hillary Clinton to me. How do we get Isaac to Pokemon Go to ages 7 to make us whole again? And speaking of redesigns, I am a little upset that Isaac's helmet comes on and off like a regular helmet. In the original games, it was a part of his suit and came off and on like a goddamn transformer, but here is just a regular helmet. This is the nitpick of all nitpicks, but it looked so cool in the original games and added more visual flair to the suit's design that just isn't in the remake. And beyond that, I genuinely don't have any complaints. Seriously, I tried looking for things to complain about and could not find any. Maybe more things will come to mind as I play through the game more, but as of right now, I have a day's worth of playtime and I haven't found anything major or minor to complain about, and I barely have any nitpicks. If you haven't picked up on it already, I absolutely love the Dead Space remake. At the start of the year, I anticipated this being my game of the year, and after playing it, I can confidently say that, oh yeah, it's gonna be up there. The first two Dead Space games are some of my all-time favorites, and the remake is almost certainly going to usurp their spot on my favorite games of all time list. If this isn't my game of the year, it's either because I found major problems in later playthroughs, which I doubt, or something even better is coming out later this year. If you like single-player horror games and for some reason haven't picked up the Dead Space remake, I highly recommend giving this one a go. It is easily the best new survival horror game I've played since probably Resident Evil 7. It's an all-timer, and hopefully it becomes a foundation for a rebirth of Dead Space going forward.